Think of yourself as a house, built with brick and mortar. Each brick is a stage of development, a memory, a lesson learned, and so on, creating the final structure. Your house is unstable. It's leaning to one side, and there are cracks beginning to show in the cement facade. What is obvious is that the structural integrity of the house is compromised. The instability, the vulnerability to fracture, and the fatigue the house is under can't stand up against the weight of daily use and wear. The house isn't optimally functional or safe to be lived in. In a house like this, the only way to fix it is to knock it down and start again. But first, you need to look through the rubble, collect and handle each individual brick, and find out what went wrong. What was it about the way the bricks were laid, or the conditions the cement was mixed in, or the quality of the tools used to put the house together in the first place, that contributed to the house falling down? The journey of achieving self-love begins at what I call ground zero. It is a place of rubble, your broken down house, and it is your job as the home builder to root through the rubble around you and figure out what caused the instability and the breakdown in the first place. What you become when you do this is your own personal archaeologist. This process is not for the purpose of placing blame or finding excuses. It is simply to look truthfully and objectively at what you've got, at what lies in your pile of rubble, and assess what did and did not work well when it came to building your house, to building you as you currently are today. When we look at a house that's falling apart, we know instantly something likely went wrong in the building process, or perhaps the house has become infested with black mold that's eating away at its structure. We logically apply cause and effect reasoning. However, when it comes to ourselves, when we see we are breaking down, struggling to cope, or feeling bad about ourselves, instead of applying the same logic, that something needs to be adjusted or fixed, or taken out entirely, we succumb to the should, could, and would, how we think we should feel given our current circumstances, that there can't be a logical reason, a cause and effect, as to why we feel this way. We conclude we are simply the problem invariably. That just isn't true. In order to find out why you struggle to like and love yourself, you need to first figure out why you don't. Without the distorted lens that you and only you are born awful and to blame, but through a careful and precise method and process, because it is a process, one that can last months, of sorting through your rubble, your past, the raw materials that went into making you who you are today and how you feel about yourself. What you need to keep in mind while doing this is not how you think you should feel, but to always refer back to the reality of how you actually feel. A builder looking at a house that has crumbled and fallen down knows, even if this house should have stayed standing, the evidence that something went awry in the building process is the fact that the house is no longer standing. In the same way, you must remember, if you don't feel good about yourself, there are reasons why, and the only way to figure it out, fix and heal, and ensure you don't have the same errors in the rebuilding process, is to excavate at ground zero, to be honest and real and take account of those reasons why, as you discover them in the rubble, without judgment and without the should have, could have, and would haves. Remember, they are not your friends. Let's go back to the beginning, how we define love. My working definition of love is a set of actions that communicate the value and worth of a person or thing to an individual. That means there are some actions that communicate value, worth, and care, while others communicate low value, disregard, and carelessness. How was love, your value, your worth, and deservedness of care communicated to you? One thing you must become enlightened about on this journey of self-love is that no one, absolutely none of us on this earth are born liking or loving themselves. Love is an action, and like any action, we are taught how. Often people confuse a child's healthy self-interest or developmentally appropriate selfishness as evidence of self-worth, which is incorrect. Natural impulses and self-interest in children is instinct and biological imperative. It is not a conscious choice made out of a child's inherent sense of worthiness above others. What does inform a child's sense of self-worth what communicates to that child whether or not they have worth, value, or deservedness of care, is how the people around them communicate their value, how they love them. And children learn very early on if their value is stable or unstable, unconditional or conditional, if they have value only in certain circumstances or when they meet certain criteria. Some of you already know, can't escape from the reality and knowledge of being let down by those who were supposed to take care of you growing up. Statistically, most of you listening will have had adverse experiences and have gone through at least one or all of the different types of abuse: verbal, emotional, psychological, physical, and sexual, meaning you already know that as a child you were undervalued and mistreated, and may have rightfully and painfully deduced that these traumatic experiences and ways of being treated are why you currently find it difficult to like, love, and trust yourself today. There is another camp of people who also feel badly about themselves, but because they haven't experienced abuse or trauma at the hands of their caretakers, assume there was nothing wrong with their childhood or the way that they were raised, and they are the problem. Denial is a very strong barrier in the minds of people like this. They often think that to critique or be unsatisfied with their upbringing makes them ungrateful, disrespectful, and unloving, which is why it's important that we remember what we are doing here. We are at ground zero and we are excavating. All we know is that our house is broken and we need to figure out why, not for the purpose of blaming anybody, but simply to find out why things fell apart in the first place, to figure out why we don't love ourselves. People often think that holding people in their lives accountable for the negative impact they might have had on their development growing up is nothing short of playing the blame game. They might say, "But I love my parents and I know they loved me." That isn't in question. What is in question is whether or not the way they expressed or didn't express their love taught you how to or how not to love yourself. You might be very logically aware that your parents or caretakers loved you and did their best, but did their actions communicate that love and value in a way that your developing self recognized and felt? This often resonates in people who have thought or said the following: "I know my parents loved me, I just never felt it." This gap between what you know and feel can be very confusing and fracturing in someone's life and development. What is important isn't how something should have, could have, or would have made you feel, but the truth of how it truthfully and actually made you feel. That is what informs how you love or don't love yourself. Today's question is, how were you taught to love yourself? And in later episodes we will go through various other external and societal influences, but today we are focusing on your early childhood, upbringing and development, the years where you were taught the value you have by those around you. I used to hate changing rooms. The harsh lighting and the flimsy curtain that never quite reached the corners or gave you any sort of privacy. I looked at the changing room bench the same way I would look at a hospital gurney, because I knew what was coming. It was a place where I would be met with a rack full of clothing that didn't fit, and the parental disappointment. It was never something that was said out loud, but the critical scan over my clothes and my body, the shake of a head and all the clothing we had to hand back, told me everything I needed to know. There was something wrong with me. I wasn't like the other teenage girls who fit these clothes. I wasn't good enough, trendy enough, too big, too short, too something. I couldn't quite verbalize what I would feel in those changing rooms. Now that I look back on it, the blur was likely a lowbrow form of disassociation, of spacing out, just waiting until the cringeworthy ordeal was over. The casual deconstruction of self and unspoken and sometimes spoken question of, why can't you just be good enough, was something I just wanted to forget. To put my clothes back on, cover my inadequate body and walk away. I can only imagine now the ways in which those experiences affected me. The shame. I never connected my emotions to my behaviour. Why I grew to view myself as nothing more than a mass of dissectable body parts to be covered and hidden. I once wore a turtleneck in 30°C heat because that to me was far less uncomfortable than incurring judgment about my body. This isn't the only instance of feeling not good enough growing up, nor is it the most traumatic. What matters more than details, however, is how each experience of feeling not good enough, undervalued and disregarded, formed my internal process of self-assessment, skewed it in favour of seeing myself negatively as bad and wrong. These experiences of not feeling good enough, of never being enough to those around me, became my metric, my unit of measurement for how I viewed myself as inherently flawed and wrong and needing to be fixed. That became my locus of evaluation. Everything I went through, did or didn't do, related back to how bad and wrong I was, and I would look to find evidence of it wherever I went. What I viewed to be the truth. It was a silent and automatic process that I wasn't even aware was running, programmed into the back of my mind from years of experiences and messaging, informing everything I would or wouldn't do. I want to go back to Gabor Maté briefly before we begin. He writes in the book The Myth of Normal about speaking with a man who wrote him a letter in response to reading Maté's book on addiction titled In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts, where he explains that addiction is a prevalent outcome of childhood trauma. The man, who was 9 years sober but still struggling, said the following: "I resist the opportunity to blame my mother. I'm a piece of shit because of me." Maté explains this response as follows: self-assaulting shame so easily moonlights as personal responsibility. This man's impulse to protect his mother was not a defense against anything I had said or implied, but against his own unacknowledged anger. Stored away in deep freeze and finding no healthy outlet, the emotion had turned against him in the form of self-hatred. For some of you, your anger towards yourself is misdirected, particularly if the idea of placing any responsibility on your parents or caretakers makes you feel uncomfortable or even afraid. When you don't deal with the truth about how your upbringing made you feel, it very easily and often just internalizes to cause self-attack, to fuel the development of one or all of the big five. Healing can't happen like this, ever. So it's time to get real about your childhood. Understand that you're not trying to shirk responsibility or blame anyone. You are just trying to figure out what went wrong. Alfie Kohn, in his book Unconditional Parenting, describes the traditional and most common mainstream form of parenting style as conditional parenting, based on the school of thought called behaviorism, commonly associated with the late American psychologist B.F. Skinner, a prolific name in behavioral analysis. Kohn writes that behaviorism, as the name suggests, is an exclusive focus on behaviors. All that matters about people, in this view, is what you can see and measure. You can't see a desire or a fear, so you might as well just concentrate on what people do. What Kohn goes on to explain is that conditional parenting hinges on this same precept, managing children's outward behaviour, a focus on the external and surface actions of the child, rather than the vital internal motivations and reasoning behind their behaviour. He writes that, when parents and teachers constantly talk about a child's behaviour, they're acting as though nothing matters except the stuff on the surface. It's not a question of who the kids are, what they think or feel or need. Forget motives and values. The idea is just to change what they do. This, of course, is an invitation to rely on discipline techniques whose only purpose is to make kids act, or stop acting in a particular way. The issue with this is it has more to do with getting children in line than it does with fostering the kind of adult we would prefer them to be. It doesn't consider the feelings, desires, fears, or complex motivations of the child. It just focuses on correcting behaviour the parent or parents find unsatisfactory, without teaching children how to think and react for themselves and consider the impact their behaviour may have on others. Kohn uses an example we've probably all seen, that awkward moment where a parent forces their reluctant child to apologise for something they've done. The parent is operating on the assumption that by being forced to apologise for something the child should be sorry for, that this will teach them to be sorry for doing whatever it is in the future. However, all this really does is teach the child that compulsory apologies, or rather saying things they don't mean or feel or believe, is how to get their parents' and peers' approval, or simply get them off their back, and that it doesn't matter whether they are truly sorry or not. They had better act like it. In many cases, not acting like it comes with a set of unpleasant consequences that range from unpleasant to abusive. The message is clear. It doesn't matter how you truly feel, It matters more how others would prefer you pretend to feel. Apologetic, happy, pleasant, peaceful. Kohn writes, children in all cultures are traditionally raised to be good boys and good girls. Consider for a moment the key word in that sentence. Good is an adjective laden with moral significance. It can be a synonym for ethical or honourable or compassionate. However, where children are concerned, the word is just as likely to mean nothing more than quiet, or perhaps not a pain in the arse to me. A good child from infancy to adolescence is one who isn't too much trouble to us as grown-ups. Now, this isn't to say parents are wrong for making their children apologise or teaching them that there are certain rules of engagement to how we act in the outside world, but fostering compliance rather than thoughtfulness, a true consideration for the feelings and motivations behind the child's behaviour, has ugly side effects, because it's never usually just limited to teaching children manners or appropriate behaviour. It's usually used to stop any and all unpleasant behaviour in children. And by unpleasant, I mean anything the parent dislikes, whether it's valid or not. That could be a child expressing any kind of anger or sadness or frustration, expressing their own true thoughts, wants and opinions if it goes against their own parents' beliefs, disallowing them to feel the full spectrum of human emotions they've been gifted with because it's inconvenient and time-consuming to help a child process how they're feeling. Kids are often told, stop sulking, don't be angry, keep quiet, sit still, don't run, jump, laugh too loud, be silly when we're at the dinner table, a gamut of things that are age-appropriate, developmentally appropriate for children, but considered inappropriate by their parents and wider society. It's reflective of an intolerance for what makes children children, a dislike for childhood and the messy, clumsy, loud way children develop and find their own autonomy and voice. I hear comments like this all the time. Children are manipulative, they'll have you wrapped around their finger, give them an inch and they'll take a mile, kids take advantage. Ascribing pretty gross ulterior motives to the innocent behaviours of a child. For some reason, our society seems to generally accept a view of children as Machiavellian mini-me's, hell-bent on manipulating and destroying their parents, and must be taught quickly and swiftly how to act, or worse, must be beaten into submission to scupper their manipulative plans. Why does our society seem to view children as beasts to be tamed, rather than complex brand new human beings trying to figure out their way in the world and discover who they are? That's a pretty rough way to begin your way in society if that's how it views you before you can even speak. Any adult who has authority over you, including teachers or extended family members, can perpetuate this. It's not exclusively a parental fault. It's a fault of our society's view and treatment of children in general. Many people have stories about feeling belittled, degraded, and humiliated by a teacher in a way that has stuck with them for years, decades even, and eroded their confidence. Insecurity that lives rent-free in your mind, allowing people who never loved you correctly in the first place to dictate how you love and view yourself now. We all know that good boys and girls are quiet, sit still, are always polite, are seen and not heard, always share, never complain, and do exactly what mummy and daddy tell them to, first time. None of which are realistic expectations of a developing infant or young child. A lot of adults don't even do it. It's certainly in both the parent and the child's best interest for them to learn to be polite, not always yell or run around in public, to be conscious of safety, etc., but more often than not, the line is crossed when it comes to behaviourism, because the objective of behaviourism and conditional parenting is control. To get kids to do what they're told, whether the parent's request is legitimate or not. Popular parenting tactics can range from corporal punishment, timeouts, or coercive tactics like bribery and negative or positive reinforcement. Kohn writes that every year there seems to be a new opinion piece on the right way to parent yourself a good child. But don't mistake new means for new ends. The goal continues to be control. Control is a very insidious and subtle thing. When a person believes they're doing something to someone else or to a child, quote unquote, for their own good, the boundary lines begin to blur. Behaviourism easily breaks away from teaching politeness and right behaviour and extends into fostering the parent's ability to control the child's likes and dislikes, the expectation that you should like what your parents like, that you should study what they want you to study, go into a field of work they want you to be qualified in, who you should date and marry, what you should do in your spare time. Kohn references Elizabeth Kagan's research on parenting books. Almost 25 years ago, a social psychologist named Elizabeth Kagan received a bushel of contemporary parenting books and concluded that they mostly reflected a blanket acceptance of parental prerogative, with little serious consideration of a child's needs, feelings, or development. The dominant assumptions, she added, seemed to be that the parent's desires are automatically legitimate, and thus the only question open for discussion was how, exactly, kids could be made to do whatever they're told. Sadly, not much has changed since then. More than 100 parenting books are published in the United States every year, along with countless articles in parenting magazines. Most of them are filled with advice about how to get children to comply with our expectations, how to make them behave, how to train them as though they were pets. This control is secured through conditional parenting. What conditional parenting is, in essence, is using love withdrawal to foster compliance, to create good boys and girls, by withholding love and approval and kindness until the behaviour or choice the child has made has been corrected. And by corrected, I mean come in alignment with what the parent wants, whether what they want is legitimate or not. And that can cross over into subjective and questionable territory. Love withdrawal tactics hinge on removal, isolation and punishment. When a child misbehaves, it's taught that it's appropriate to remove their personal belongings or sit them on a step or a chair alone, withhold affection and attention until they get back in line. Kohn writes that time out is a form of love withdrawal. It poses the threat of separation and abandonment, disciplinary separation. Even the most popular and seemingly kindest method of parenting lauded in the mainstream today, positive reinforcement, is considered by Kohn to be nothing more than what he calls sugar-coated control, lavishing attention, love, and approval on a child when they perform behaviours the parent deems right. While this doesn't encourage parents to punish or withhold affection when the child misbehaves in the parent's eyes, children are not stupid, nor does this behavioural tactic assume them to be. The whole point of positive reinforcement is for the child to deduce that when I act a certain way, mum and dad or my caretakers are happy with me. They love me more than when I do things they don't like. Through positive reinforcement, how does a child know their caretaker doesn't like something? Well, that positive attention, love and affection simply isn't available when they're not behaving in a certain way. You might be thinking, well, that's the way the world works. And to that I would say, therein lies the problem. If love is only available when you are pleasant, happy, quiet, pleasing and compliant, where does that leave you the rest of the time? Likely the majority of the time when you're not any of those things. What conditional parenting tactics teaches children is that love that should be there for them unconditionally by their caregivers can and will be taken away from them if they do, act or feel something contrary to what their parents want from them. That being their own person with their own complex feelings and desires isn't tolerated. That love is not available for them when they are angry and upset or frustrated, when they are just being themselves, in all their awkward, frustrating and contradictory childish glory. But love is only available when they are doing things that make others happy. When you consider that it's a child's biological imperative, their nature to secure and grow out of their parents' love, parental alienation, selective approval and love withdrawal is downright cruel. Physical punishment is always abusive. With this in mind, I want you to ask yourself the following question. What did my parents or caretakers require me to do to earn their love? Love here can be synonymous with approval and acceptance. Do you know how I know that many of you listening, many people worldwide, have been conditionally parented and had to earn their parents' love through certain behaviours and choices? Because children of conditional parents become conditional adults, unable to offer themselves or others compassion, patience, time, tolerance, and most importantly, acceptance when they are not behaving or feeling how they think they should be, when they have an off day and aren't feeling so cheerful. Instead of giving themselves the kindness and gentleness, the acceptance of how they are feeling, conditional adults often spend hours berating themselves for feeling negatively, lambasting themselves for not being positive enough people, for being at fault. Conditional adults are not able to sit comfortably with their negative emotions because in childhood, quote-unquote negative feelings were a bad thing, that children with negative emotions or behaviours don't deserve love, and they continue on treating themselves like this as adults. Discipline without love might yield short-term compliance, but the long-term results are life-altering, negatively life-altering. The sad thing about this is that for many people, their parents never had bad intentions, whether that be they were just doing what they were taught was right, following popular and recommended parenting advice, or modelling their own parents. However, as Kohn explains, unfortunately, the intentions don't matter. How we feel about our kids isn't as important as how they experience those feelings and how they regard the way we treat them. What matters is the message our kids receive, not the one we think we're sending. What kind of awkward or upsetting messaging, intentional or unintentional, did you receive about yourself growing up? Examples of this kind of awkward parenting I've seen out in the wild, in the real world, once I was at the park and a little girl came riding down on the hill on her scooter and she fell and scraped her hands and obviously cried, howled, of course, understandable. And myself and another elderly lady came to help her pick up her scooter while her mum picked her up. But while the girl was still crying and clearly in distress, she hadn't yet had the time to calm herself down and self-regulate. She couldn't have been more than 4 or 5 years old. Her mum kept insisting she say thank you to the elderly lady, which of course made her even more distressed, because the last thing on her mind was being polite right now. She was still in pain, hadn't yet stopped crying, and honestly, it was painful to watch. She was being asked to do something a kid doesn't have the capacity to do, self-regulate instantaneously, and put aside her fresh upset to be polite to a stranger she'll never see again. Another time on the train, there was another little girl crying. She was sitting beside her grandmother, and I'm not sure what set her off, but when her grandmother couldn't get her to stop crying by asking, she began hitting her, on the train in front of everybody, again and again telling her to stop crying. Does that make any sense at all? Who wouldn't cry or be upset if they were being hit seemingly for no reason? So many times children's emotions are minimized, forced or beaten out of them because of their parents' or caregivers' fear, embarrassment or anger. And the more intense the fear, embarrassment and anger the parent feels, the harsher and more severe the punishment or attempt to control the child is in response. Sometimes we really do expect too much of children, more than they have the capacity for yet. And I understand that being a parent is stressful, that it comes with minimal support and many critical opinions like mine. Some parents just don't have the emotional range or energy to be patient and compassionate with their children, and you'll often find they are the same way with themselves. That's not what I'm arguing here. What I'm concerned about is the effect it has on the child, the effect it had on you. That's all. Regardless of the parent or caregiver's justification for the way they reacted, what impact did these kinds of instances growing up have on you? The most common one I can tell you across the board is emotional repression, stuffing and being disconnected from your emotions, and with that comes toxic self-blame. It's one of the major birthplaces of should have, could have, would have thinking, because the child is taught to doubt their first instinct and reactions. Therefore, they are taught that they can't trust their own perception or feelings, and this continues on into adulthood. If you struggle with self-hate, you likely feel you cannot trust yourself in any way. Your feelings, opinions, perceptions, only the negative ones ring true for you, because your locus of evaluation is set to I'm bad and wrong. Let's find out how. Telling kids to not be upset about things they should absolutely be upset about, that they are rightfully upset about, is a surefire way to raise them to be adults who are emotionally disconnected, unstable, and varying degrees of fucked up. Stop crying or I'll give you something to cry about. Wipe that look off your face before I do it for you. Boys don't cry. Don't be a pussy. Girls should be nice. Don't be a bitch. You don't get to tell me no. I'm your mother, father, aunt, uncle, cousin, brother, sister, teacher, carer. You don't have the right to be angry at me. Shut up. No one wants to hear you. All the many ways we are taught not to trust our own experience and self-expression, to second-guess everything, not to trust ourselves. No wonder you can't understand yourself, and we grow up and hate ourselves for it. If you're going to love yourself, you're going to have to connect to the toxic beliefs and systems you grew up in that are in place within your internal processing system now, and work on recognizing and undermining them as the obstacles they are. But you can't do that if you don't know what they are or why they're there. How can you challenge a lie that you believe is a truth? First, by discovering it's even there. What kind of messaging did you receive about who you are and the kind of person you should be? Were you called things like stupid or lazy, slow, useless, ugly, undeserving, ungrateful, never gets anything right, not good enough? Or did no one ever have to say those words? That's just how they made you feel. What kind of person did you have to become in response to this? There are many studies that prove that corporal punishment, verbal and physical abuse, being raised in a controlling and restrictive household, being pushed for academic excellence at the detriment of your well-being as a child, or living in a household that was neither cruel nor bad, but with emotionally unavailable parents, receiving early childhood rejection, yields ruinous results. And guess what they are? You're right, the big five. Self-hatred, anxiety, depression, addiction, self-harm. I hope you're noticing the pattern here. Self-hatred is often synonymous with toxic anger as well. If you're angry, you need to accept that there is a legitimate reason why, even if you currently think there isn't one. If you were raised in an environment where only certain behaviour and choices were tolerated, and I'm not talking about the appropriate things like politeness and proper conduct, I'm talking about the restrictive and unfair expectations such as never being allowed to express your upset, anger or disagreement, not being allowed to stick up for yourself, being ridiculed or guilt-tripped for making mistakes or choosing something different than what your parents wanted. Everything from what clothes you wore, what sports you were or weren't into, the music you liked, your friends, anything that made you feel like your parents loved you less, unless you just complied with what they wanted. If that was the environment you were raised in, no wonder you don't love yourself. You weren't taught how. You weren't taught that the cornerstone of love is unconditional acceptance and patience. Patience to work through the unpleasant and ugly emotions and feelings we all have without the threat of rejection looming over you as a consequence. When children are taught only certain parts of them, not all of them, are acceptable, that their feelings and desires don't matter, what this does is create a split within the personality of a child and the adult they become. A split that divides them into their true self and their false self. The false self is a defensive facade. The false self is an adaptive personality that knows how to act to receive the vital and life-giving love and approval the individual needs. The issue with this is that in a conditional environment, the false self has to be just that, false. The false self's imperative is to act contrary to the actual wants and needs of the individual and only do what needs to be done to secure the acceptance and love they need and desire. When you are taught, as Kohn writes, that love is a scarce commodity to be rationed, this comes with a kind of anxious desperation that can follow the individual into every situation, friendships, relationships, the workplace, an anxious attachment that's sole prerogative is to not feel the soul-destroying rejection that they have previously experienced and want to avoid happening again. However, again, because the false self is false, this creates an unpleasant dissonance between who the individual is and who they feel they must pretend to be acceptable. While their false self might be very successful at avoiding rejection, the false self knows that it's false, and the person operating out of their false self-identity knows that their true self lies hidden underneath, and that the approval and acceptance they receive is based on dishonesty, inauthenticity and lies. It is a heartbreaking and soul-destroying reality to reckon with that the people who you care about most would not love you if you were just being yourself, that they only seem able to approve of and accept and love the false version of you, and that is the birthplace of self-hatred. Knowing you are not who you pretend to be, feeling that the real you is not worthy of love, self-hatred bubbles up like lava from that chasm of dissonance between the true self and the false self, because the true self, the real desires, motivations, and legitimate needs of the individual may be well buried, but they never go away. Inauthenticity, feeling like you are being fake, leaves an unpleasant feeling that fuels the fire. If only they knew who I really was, they would never love me then. I tried being myself once and I was hated and punished for it. There is something wrong with the real me. I hate who I truly am. What children who are conditionally parented are taught is that the full spectrum of their humanity, the good and the imperfect, the positives and the negatives and contradictions, who they really are, is unworthy of love. And they become adults who believe it, act on it, and live like it, often without even realizing that that's the paradigm they are operating out of, a place of rejection, inadequacy, and hiding who they really are, of feeling unworthy, unlovable, and hateful at their core, all of which foster the Big Five, the full expression of self-hatred. People who have been raised like this are unable to believe that they have inherent worth or value. Why? Because love is an action that communicates value. And if you have been taught only parts of you, not all of you, is worthy or valuable, that is your experience of love and the love you believe you deserve. I cannot stress or overstate enough how much children, people, need love to flourish in all areas of life. How detrimental not receiving that love is on childhood and adolescent development, self-esteem and future prospects, probability of addiction, substance abuse, and reckless or antisocial behaviour. There is this despicable idea in parenting circles that it's possible to love a child too much, when in fact the opposite is true. There are far more proven detrimental effects to not loving a child enough, or communicating that love to them in a way that they receive and believe. Love cannot spoil a child. Shitty parenting does. Children are great at retaining information, but often with their lack of cognition and still growing brain, they are not great interpreters of that information. A child isn't able to coherently reason that their parent is stressed or struggling with finances, or maybe dealing with substance abuse, which is why they aren't being loving or present, or are acting cruelly. A child's only frame of reference is their caretakers and themselves. And because of that, they often conclude, the problem is me, themselves. And many times, that is what they are being explicitly taught. If you were raised in an explicitly abusive household where any and all expressions of yourself, just your existence, was treated with cruelty and contempt, you know this intimately. Children who grow up in both scenarios, and children who grow up being neglected, not receiving love or disapproval, but rather their existence being ignored, are left with the same question that follows them throughout their entire life. What is wrong with me? The assumption is that there logically must be something, some reason why they were not deemed worthy, lovable, or good enough by the people in their lives whose responsibility it was to teach them that they are. So many people spend their entire lives trying to escape this feeling. Perfectionism is the most common symptom, but often people are left trying to figure out what they need to do and who they need to be and become to not feel so unlovable, so unworthy. They feel the need to outrun and become anything other than the little boy or girl they were who was treated as though they weren't worthy of love. And this never works. Why? Because your true self is always there. Because it is the real you, the you ignore, the you don't allow to express themselves, to recognize their experiences and traumas and help them work through it, instead of assuming what's needed is to change everything about them. You cannot change yourself out of self-hatred. The further you lean into strengthening the false self, the person you think you should be to be worthy of love, instead of the person you are, the more the self-hatred grows, because you're not being real and true. And that's not love. And you're therefore continuing the detrimental and learned pattern of denying your true self. Love is a legitimate and developmental need. Not a want or a desire, it is a need, a necessity. Without it, we begin to wither or self-destruct. Please stop believing the lie that you don't need love. It is a necessity for brain development, long-term health and well-being and quality of life, so that desperation you may feel, that you might ridicule or shame yourself for. It is a legitimate need, and you just haven't yet been taught how to meet it. My intention isn't to vilify parents trying their best. There are many of you whose parents' economic situation alone meant they couldn't be physically and emotionally present through no fault of their own, where your wants and needs were unable to be met for very practical reasons. but that doesn't mean it all still didn't affect you and the way you saw and currently see yourself. My biggest frustration with my own journey of self-love is the realization that self-love does not exist in a vacuum, and we would all benefit from not pretending that it does. How you love yourself is informed by the way you were first loved and how you are or are not loved now. Your future experience of love will also inform that belief, and it is beyond unhelpful to be told that searching for love outside of yourself is wrong and something to be ashamed of, when in fact it's one of our most basic and essential human needs. The issue arises when we don't know how to receive and find love that is actually healthy and loving and honours our true worth and value, our true self. When we accept whatever we can find, scraps we're given, when we find love that mimics the unkind, conditional, or chaotic relationships we may have had with our parents. Some people may have had great relationships with their parents and always felt loved at home, but received pervasive and destructive conditional acceptance or non-acceptance from their peers at school, or wider societal messaging about who they were and or the way they looked. The effect is the same. Who and what taught you you weren't good enough? You will not be able to find the kind of healthy, life-giving love you need externally until you first begin to understand, internalize, and believe your own inherent worth and value, despite what you may have been told or led to believe growing up. When your true self is allowed to exist and receive acceptance from you first and foremost. And I understand how difficult that is to do when your life experiences may amount to being continually taught otherwise. What I'm asking you to do is not believe the lie anymore, to know that it is a lie, to consider that even if your caretakers were unable to show it to you, that you do have inherent, intrinsic, high worth and value, and in order to do that, you need to be able to know what you were made to feel and believe that is contrary to that, and continually choose to believe that it's not a true reflection of your actual worth and value, and to not let those embedded and learned beliefs influence your future behaviour. Because up until now, I guarantee they have been. And the only way to challenge those beliefs is to first know and acknowledge and accept, as painful as it is, that they are there. I'm going to read another passage and a few excerpts from the book that talk about this. A group of researchers at the University of Denver has shown that teenagers who feel they have to fulfill certain conditions in order to win their parents' approval may end up not liking themselves. That in turn may lead a given adolescent to construct a false self, in other words, to pretend to be the kind of person whom his or her parents will love. This desperate strategy to gain acceptance is often associated with depression, a sense of hopelessness, and a tendency to lose touch with one's true self. At some point, such teenagers may not even know who they really are because they've had to work so hard to become something they're not. I'm just interjecting here to say that this means existing not knowing who you really are, but only knowing that whoever you really are isn't lovable. When children receive affection with strings attached, they tend to accept themselves only with strings attached. And their adult relationships may be warped by a need to avoid attachment, perhaps because they live in dread of being abandoned all over again. More care is shown to children's behavioural development rather than their moral development, whether they truly believe the difference between right and wrong for themselves. If you grow up like this, that means your sense of worth is likely to fluctuate depending on your circumstances and accomplishments and others' opinion of you, rather than a constant fact of being and possessing of inherent worth. You feel great when you succeed and worthless when you fail. That extreme fluctuation is only the beginning of the consequences of basing one's sense of worth on living up to a set of expectations, either other people's or one's own. For example, if they feel good about themselves only when they think they look good, they become susceptible to eating disorders. People who, as a rule, don't think their value hinges on their performance are more likely to see failure as just a temporary setback, a problem to be solved. They also seem less likely to be anxious or depressed. And one more thing, they're less likely to be concerned about the whole issue of self-esteem, because they are not exhausting time figuring out how they can be good enough. They already know they are. What I found especially interesting was this. What I've come to see and believe is true all along. Kohn writes, by contrast, unconditional self-esteem, the very sort that's most likely to be ridiculed in some quarters, turns out to be the best goal to shoot for. That is the point of this podcast. All of us have been through some variation of this. No person is able to possess or express full unconditional love 100% of the time, especially not imperfect, often stressed out parents. We are human and fallible. We've been over that, so the point isn't to place blame or be ungrateful. It's to deal with whatever didn't work and the way it affects us now, not so that we can feel resentful and sorry for ourselves, but so that we can move on. Because being unable to love yourself is being stuck. Many of us are stuck in our childhoods, are stuck in our infant and adolescent thoughts and mindsets, but running around the world acting like adults. I will never tell you to fake it till you make it, because faking it never works. Dishonesty, falsity, denial, being phony and inauthentic, all of these continue to propagate self-hatred because they rely on acting outside of your real self, not giving you the eyes to see that you are capable of being the person you only think you can pretend to be, rather than actually working out of who you really are and what you're capable of. Stop faking and start doing. Loving yourself means getting unstuck, shooting for that goal of unconditional self-esteem inside yourself so that you can go on and live the rest of your life well. The rift between your true self, who you truly are, what you want and need, and your false self, who you have to pretend to be to receive the love you need, often leads to anger. That anger can be internalized into self-hatred, especially if an individual is loyal and protective of their own parents or caretakers. Sometimes people aren't sad or depressed, they are angry and have no healthy, safe way they know of to express it. The thought of ever feeling angry toward their parents that they adore is unthinkable. But emotions aren't just loose leaves of paper you can discard. They persist until they're dealt with. And so in many cases that anger, needing to find an outlet, just turns inward. Because for many it is easier to hate themselves than to deal with the pain and the grief that comes with realizing that although they may love their parents and their parents love them, that there were areas where they did things wrong, that hurt and affected them negatively, that there are areas that you were let down, that as loving as they tried to be, where their parents simply failed them. Some don't even know they're angry, nor do they realize that in some cases they should be. Grief is a tricky thing. It is often contradictory and unpredictable. It can explode, simmer, or calcify. It doesn't follow any logical terms of agreement. Denial is often the hardest hurdle to overcome on your journey to healing and self-love. Growing up having to deny how you feel, deny what you truly want, has trained you and many others to continue doing so in any and all circumstances. The polarity and inflexibility of conditional parenting also does a disservice by teaching you that two opposing things can't exist at once, that one can be both angry, petulant and silly, happy and fun, and still be lovable. That you can love and appreciate and understand and hold no judgment or blame for your parents and the way you were raised, but still deep down be angry at them for how they made you feel. So, how do I love myself with this reality? Once again, it is necessary to discard should, could, and would, how you think you should feel based on context or your feelings towards your parents. You need to begin to honor your true self, how you really feel about how you were brought up. That is the challenge I want to pose to you this week, to be brave enough to begin to practice something you may never have received growing up: radical acceptance. To hold that lesson of self-neutrality, of acceptance of the messiness of your humanity, without judgment, root through the rubble brick by brick and honestly and objectively catalogue how you feel. Don't make excuses, don't try and reason your way out of it because that just solidifies the denial and widens the rift. Be honest, it will save you. That is how you love yourself. You be honest with yourself. So, this week, your task is to write it down. Not like this. Yes, actually, I know my mum had to work late nights to take care of us and I appreciate her for that and actually I should be grateful, and no. You've likely done enough of that. You're not speaking on behalf of your parents anymore. Keep it simple and objective, like the brief jotting down of facts of an archaeologist or a builder searching through rubble. You're not letting go of compassion for your parents or caretakers here. You're holding space for yourself and the reality of your experience. For example, writing down something like, I felt abandoned when my mum worked late nights, or my dad treated my sister better than me and that made me feel not good enough, full stop. I felt ignored as the middle child or the youngest child. I never felt listened to and that made me feel like my opinions didn't matter. Keep it to a sentence and catalogue it all down, one by one. What you're doing here is closing the gap between your false self and your true self by kindly holding space for your truth, without the judgment, which will come, but try your hardest to withhold the self-criticism when you do this, without the punishments or self-harm. You need to do this because you cannot heal from something you deny or don't know is there. You can't heal by telling yourself, well, I shouldn't be feeling this way because I know my parents were just trying their best and we didn't have much and XYZ. No. This is a disservice to the child you once were and the adult you are now. Minimizing and silencing how you truly feel only continues self-hatred, because when you are not being honest, true, something deep within you knows it, dislikes it, and resents feeling phony. If you're here, I know you felt it. And all that does is give your self-hatred more fuel, more reasons to torment you. Once this list is done, little by little, consider and again write it down because it helps to see it plainly. Any way you think, each sentence, the feeling or belief behind it influences how you feel and behave today. First about yourself and secondly how you interact with others. For example, do you feel the need to be funny or impress people, to people please? Are you drawn to cold people because you enjoy winning over their approval? Do you dress to be noticed or to blend in? Could this be because you felt like you had to make your mother laugh or you only felt approved of when you dressed up? Consider it all. Why? Because once you uncover the motivation behind the feelings and behaviours you have, you are far better equipped to challenge and change the behaviours you don't want to continue in the future. You are finding out the origin and the existence of your triggers, how they affect you and the way you live your life. Also, pay attention to the non-verbal cues your body gives you. Do you feel spaced out or detached when someone is yelling at you or talking too fast? Do you shut down or become disproportionately angry and defensive when certain things happen that are outside of your control, or someone says or does something specific? What are the things, daily interactions and events that seem to catapult you back into emotional and psychological space that feels awful? Pete Walker, the author of CPTSD From Surviving to Thriving, a book I personally used in recovery and most definitely the book that started my healing, calls these experiences emotional flashbacks. They are clues that some non-verbal and even pre-verbal part of us is stuck reliving feelings and emotions from the not-so-distant past. And there are reasons for this that are worth discovering, and only through that discovery, awareness, and careful self-regulation can we begin to loosen the life-altering hold these emotional and physical experiences have on our daily lives and progression. I know personally I am triggered by chaotic and crowded environments, so I know now how to either avoid certain situations or manage and take care of myself if I can expect to be in an environment like that. I have a friend that now when she feels critical about her appearance or how her hair looks tells herself out loud, "You sound like your mother. You were taught you had to look perfect to be acceptable. That just isn't true. Are we choosing to believe mum or me today?" I'm glad to say she more often than not chooses herself. That's not to say insecurity goes away, but it certainly loses its potency when you realise, I don't actually believe this. I was taught to believe this, and I'm now in the process of unteaching myself this and relearning something better and healthier for me. That is how you love yourself rightly. Now here comes the fine print. This isn't going to be achieved through one exercise or through one podcast episode. This is a process. I really should put that on a t-shirt. Expect to hear it a lot. It's a process that will take time, maybe a lot longer than you realise or are comfortable with. Herein lies the value of therapy. Bear with me. I understand that therapy doesn't work for everyone, but I believe the right therapist does. Let me say that again. Therapy doesn't work for everyone, but the right therapist does. Discovering and unlearning negative thought patterns influenced by childhood, investigating your family system, and working on how that affects you today takes time. There are many things that might not even come to mind for a while, and you'll need the help, the objective support of a trained professional to help you walk through it. You can choose to do it alone. You can write down each memory or instance that comes up in daily life, but many times, as we've already discussed, denial is second nature for many of us dealing with self-hatred, and there are many behaviours and beliefs we ourselves have that we would benefit from having someone else question, when we don't have the capacity, knowledge, or tools to do so ourselves. And practically, it's also nice to have it in your schedule, to know that, okay, on Wednesday or Friday or whatever, we deal with my shit. I can prepare myself for that. I'm not here to convince you, honestly. Therapy has worked tremendously for me and for many others. If you hate yourself, I consider it a non-negotiable. But I also know there are many reasons people can't access therapy financially, because of time constraints, etc. The cost of private therapy where I live compared to the US is mind-boggling. So it doesn't feel right to virtue signal about therapy. It works if you can access it and get the right therapist. But if that's not possible, do the exercise and make it a habit. Whenever something comes up, write it down and begin to think of how you can challenge the validity of the things you've been taught to feel and believe, particularly if you even want to keep carrying those beliefs around. Sometimes I ask myself, who wins? Who wins if I continue to believe I'm nothing? If I hate myself? If I deny myself the things I need or want? I never like the answer, and the answer is never satisfactory. Because all that really matters is that I lose every time I betray myself or give in to self-hating beliefs. So I'm just not doing it anymore. And that's another vital component of learning to love yourself. Tenacity. Are you going to let your life, your future, be run by false and hurtful beliefs, dictated by people who were not equipped to or just didn't love you? It's time to access some of that anger for your own good, to stand by your side for a change and say no more. If you were overtly and heinously abused as a child, if you know exactly how your parents not only failed you, but actively betrayed you, mistreated, took advantage, bullied, and hurt you, you especially need to and deserve to be angry and upset, and to say no more will you let those people influence how you live the rest of your life. Your parents did not treat you according to your worth. They failed to see it. They didn't want to see it, because then they would have had to admit the way they treated you was wrong, and it was and is wrong. You are not wrong. Your worth is not in question. It never was. What is in question now is whether you choose to believe the actions and beliefs of others who refuse to see it, or are you going to live by the truth? You had worth all along. Inherent worth, and that can be excruciatingly painful to reconcile. But it's worth it. You have value. You will need this choice, this tenacity to carry you through the peaks and troughs of healing from trauma, because our bodies hold these memories and beliefs even if our mind decides to move on or forget. And healing from trauma is always a process of healing both the body and the mind and the soul. And you have to believe you are worth putting in that effort to heal it, because you are, and you can. I truly believe that, not because I'm a wishful thinker, but because I've done it. I do it daily. There is life after abuse. There is healing from trauma. I didn't believe there was, and I remember saying I don't believe I can heal from trauma, but if I do, then I'll know anyone can. Well, here we are. For those of you who can access therapy and are looking into it, this is going to be another challenge in choosing you. Finding the right therapist is a lot like finding the right partner. It's a lot like dating at first. You need to be clear about what it is you're looking for, and you need to pay attention to the red flags. If you feel uncomfortable and unable to speak freely and honestly, that isn't the therapist for you. If they make you feel judged or shamed, do not see them again. If you feel they don't understand you, they're not the one for you. For those of you dealing with self-hatred, it is important that you pick a therapist who is educated in complex family systems, families of origin, trauma, CPTSD. Also look into the criteria and differences between person-centered therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, and dialectical behavioral therapy, and see which one resonates with you. Perhaps try all three if you can and stick with what works. I would especially suggest choosing a therapist of the same gender and ethnicity as you, even the same belief system if it applies, and as you will need someone who understands you and the context you come from because that's what you're going to be delving into, and sometimes you don't have the time or energy to explain things you and people like you already know. Your therapist needs to be trustworthy and show integrity. They should be transparent with you on their fees and processes and be able to explain to you how they work and also what they expect of you. Most therapists offer free consultation calls nowadays, and you can tell a lot from a good conversation. And if you get a bad vibe, trust your gut and find someone else. Your therapist needs to walk a fine line between being professional and compassionate, but also be able to kindly challenge you. There are things you might not like to hear, and changing therapists every time that happens isn't feasible or helpful on your journey. But if you have trust and rapport with your therapist, understanding that they are also human and don't have all the answers, but you can develop a good enough relationship with them where you feel comfortable enough to speak and also feel heard, a lot of healing and progress can happen because of that alone. In the meantime, if you can't feasibly see a therapist or simply just don't want one, I would recommend what author and therapist Pete Walker calls a community of authors. Books like his own, See PTSD from Surviving to Thriving, and Bessel van der Kolk, The Body Keeps the Score, are all valuable books to have in your toolkit, even if you can see a therapist, because they give you an essential component to healing, which is understanding, validation of your experiences, and the necessary vocabulary to put words to what it is you have experienced and felt. And the first step to mastery is understanding. Once you know what you're dealing with, discover that you're not the only one feeling this way and begin to understand it as what it is, as a result of something else. You are then equipped to heal it. Both Pete Walker and Bessel van der Kolk's books are my personal favourites because they not only put vocabulary to the problem, they also provide chapters on what to actually do about it, practically, which is what you need. Practical tools that equip you to get out of this stuck place, not just wise words. There are also tons of resources online that can equip you with the tools to independently seek healing. On YouTube, for those of you who identify with everything discussed in this episode and relate to common symptoms of adverse childhood experiences, such as emotional flashbacks, any of the big five, struggles with codependency, people-pleasing, emotional volatility, and repetitive patterns of dysfunction in relationships, friendship, the workplace, any one of these, I would recommend Anne Runkle, also known as the Crappy Childhood Fairy on YouTube, and Patrick Tehan, LICSW, who make phenomenal, empathetic, and easy to understand content regarding the effects of childhood trauma and how to heal it. They both have a refreshing, no BS approach and direct way of speaking. What makes them both truly special, in my opinion, and so effective at uncovering and giving advice on how to manage being an adult with these adverse experiences, is that they draw from their own experiences and childhood trauma. They know what they're talking about, not only because they are educated and well-researched, but because they've been through it. They know what it's like and how to fix it. First and foremost, because they were able to do so for themselves. Both Anne and Patrick have online courses and resources on specific topics and issues that would be helpful for those of you looking for targeted help in specific areas of your life. Please check them out. Like any kind of strength training, it may take a while to see results. When you start rooting around the rubble, it might seem like the debris is endless. You will feel the pain of excavating. Like you keep picking up new things, new faults in the brickwork. But stick with it, because eventually each brick stacked back on top of each other creates a full structure that will become the roadmap for how to continue on the rest of your life without these same things holding you back. Our parents and caretakers, the adults in charge of nurturing us, are people too. They have faults, they were and never could be perfect. Many parents are driven by fear when it comes to parenting their kids, genuine worry and concern that can become toxic and controlling. It's not a secret, nor is it rare, for many parents to care more about how things look, rather than how their kids feel. Some parents care more about being obeyed than making sure their children grow up to have a strong sense of self or opinion of their own. Many parents loathe and can't stomach the idea that their children could grow up to think, believe, feel, and value things differently to them. Something they make known. I think where many parents go wrong is the assumption that a human being, fresh out the womb, is simply a blank canvas, a living, breathing, clean slate on which to imprint your will upon. And while yes, children are, as we've covered, susceptible to becoming who their parents want them to be, it is a much healthier and holistic view to see one's child as what they are, a small human being, who already possesses many traits and predetermined skills, value and autonomy that have nothing to do with their parents, and it is a parent's job to discover and kindly, lovingly nurture and encourage who the child was always going to become, not just who they want them to be, and the job they want them to have. It reminds me of the statue of David, how Michelangelo said that David was already in the stone, he just had to chisel him out, meaning that he was already all there. Michelangelo is the sculptor, and many parents have the job of discovering and caring for what is already there within their person. More respect for the personhood, the inbuilt nature of each child would do a lot of good in raising children who learn there isn't something wrong with them. They are who they are, and that's a good thing, not something to be fixed, because they were never broken. It is now your turn to treat yourself with that same patient, inquisitive, and caring self-discovery. Chisel the rock, little by little, to uncover your true self, who has always been there and has always been worthy of love. Eventually, you learn how to integrate the two, how to operate out of your true self. This process is going to connect you with your true self, safely, and one day you will feel, like I have, the freedom and peace that comes from being who you are imperfectly, and knowing that you are valuable, the kind of love and validation that comes from being loved for who you really are, and not who you pretend to be, from denying access from those who fail to see or respect your value, is vitalizing. It's great, but that's for another episode, and not for today. I've given you a lot to think about already. Take your time. Thank you for joining me on this episode of the podcast, and listener, if no one's ever told you, or if no one ever meant it, you deserve love. Now go love yourself. As always, the episode resources and references, disclaimers and social media links will be in the show notes and description. The uncensored audio podcast episodes are available on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Details on how to support the podcast are also listed in the show notes and description if you feel so inclined. If you would like access to the uncensored vodcast of the episode you just watched, as well as journal prompts and reading material, this is available through Patreon membership. Sign up to the mailing list to keep up to date with what happens next with the channel and the future of the podcast. All of this information and more about us can also be found on the Scattered Seeds website. Bye.